Baltimore is on track for one of the city's deadliest years.
Baltimore is a cautionary tale of when anti-police rhetoric, activist judges, and rogue prosecutors collide. The charmed city currently has some of the highest murder rates and violent crime rates in any city in the country. However, this hasn't stopped the brave men and women of the Baltimore Police Department and the Baltimore City School Police Force from suiting up and showing up every day to serve their communities. Today we're joined by Clyde Boatwright, a police sergeant with the Baltimore City School Police Force, its union president, and the president of the Maryland Fraternal Order Police. I am Patrick Yoes, National President of Fraternal Order Police. This is the Blue View. Well, Clyde, thanks for joining us today and coming back. We had you a year ago. We talked about a lot of issues going on in Baltimore, but I want to talk a little bit different. Take a little different approach. Your role is working within the schools. But before we do that, how about telling our listeners and our viewers a little bit about yourself?
I've been in law enforcement for this will be my 23rd year when I hit my anniversary. I've spent the last 20 years with my current department, which is the Baltimore City School Police Force. It's a department at our highest. A few years ago, we were at 143 police officers, so we're a little lower than that now. In my role, I'm a sergeant that's assigned to external operations, which is my role as the Maryland State Lodge President, but also the local Lodge President. So I handle exclusively all of the labor issues as it deals with Baltimore City School Police.
Well, cool. What I want to do is probably the best job I ever had in my 36 years of law enforcement. It was the time as I served as a resource officer. I truly loved it. Felt like I was doing some good. But there's a lot of talk these days about whether we should have police in schools. And I think there's a lot of misconceptions of what our actual role is in schools and why it's necessary for it to have it. But if we could just unpack it a little bit. First, it's hard to talk about the climate in a school without talking about the climate of a city.
Yes.
And you're in the middle of Baltimore.
Yes.
And really a school is really nothing more than a microcosm of the community it's serving. And you've got some of the record crime going on in Baltimore, itself. You get we're coming off a year where we've got more law enforcement officers shot across this country and violence towards law enforcement officers. But not only that, crime is really on an increase in Baltimore. Let's talk a little bit about just the atmosphere that's in Baltimore and just the dangers of where we are as a city.
Yeah, so across the country we do see high levels of violence, but it's a little bit different in Baltimore and different in the fact that, we see over 700 non-fatal shootings. And over 300 homicides each year. And so when you combine the two, you got over 1,000 people that are permanently impacted. And in some way, shape, or form, or more.
Or their families.
Yeah.
Their families impacted as well.
Yeah, and that was going to be the lead in I was going with that, you've got, if there's a parent, if there's a student themselves, or if it's a sibling of someone that was a victim of one of these crimes that we have. In some cases, sometimes these issues that happen in the community do bleed over into schools. And so, as police officers, we are charged with the responsibility of one, as we know, to be the barrier between all that's good in schools and all of the madness that could be outside. And so we deal directly as a school-based guy. You would deal directly with some of the external forces that are happening outside in the community.
I've always, when I was a resource officer, I tell you, I can't tell you how many times we had this great working relationship with the guys that work patrol. And if there was an incident that happened in a community, they would call me, and I would have kids in some cases, before they even got off the bus. Some cases, we'd actually get them before they actually got on the bus, knowing that the things that happen within a community potentially were powder kegs.
Yes.
And, schools, if it's going to happen in a community, it's going to spill over, and it's going to disrupt the learning environment. So, there's a whole lot of, ways that we can go and talk about why it's important to have law enforcement officers in schools. But I can tell you, just from what you identified, I can't tell you how many times that I'm confident that we caused and were able to have an impact on those incidents that happen within a community to make sure that the kids, when they showed up at school, didn't continue it. It was that intervention, bringing in school counselors and pulling everyone in, and in some cases even the parents, and trying to neutralize these things so that we could have a safe learning environment as opposed to the things that happen within a community. And I can give you example after example after example. Let's talk about the role of that you have and your agency has in Baltimore and within the schools. Why it's so important for us to have law enforcement officers in the schools working where our kids are.
So we're unique in the city of Baltimore in the fact that we have a city police department that's comprised of officers that respond to 911 calls. We have a sheriff's office that's responsible for handling all of the courthouse issues, and then we have a school police department, which is a total separate department from each of the sheriff's office and the city police department. And our primary focus is the 84,000 students in the city school system and 190 buildings that the school system owns. So it's a big city, and so our role is to be the primary law enforcement officer as it relates to issues that happen in schools. But it actually goes a little bit further because we're able to partner with the sheriff's office, we're able to partner with the city police, and we have a lot of working relationship with information sharing. And so that goes into your point of some of the things that happen in a community. We get the information real time. And one, it's because of the way we communicate with our radio system, the way we communicate with technology, with group text messages, the way we communicate with emails and things like that. So information sharing amongst the department is really, really key. But that also helps both us to deal with issues that may come to the school building, but it also helps with our local jurisdiction, city police, because if we have something that happens in school that could spill over into the neighborhood, they have real-time information and they're able to deal with it when it's off-peak hours of the school day.
Yeah. So what's your largest school?
We have a school of about 4,000 students.
All right. What's your smallest?
About 100.
All right.
And these are high schools.
Well, I want to make a comparison of maybe the argument that we shouldn't have law enforcement officers in schools. There's a whole lot of reasons, and we'll unpack them all. We'll talk about all of the dynamics of why it's beneficial to have them in schools. But I want to point something out. I'm sure just where I live and where you live is probably the same thing. If you are going to have an event where you're going to gather a group of people together, even as small as 100 people at an event, then you probably have ordinances that are in place from the city of Baltimore that requires you to have a security plan, have your security in place, have to have permits and all of these things. Because they recognize that these events, even as small as 100, has the potential that they need to have safety added into it.
Yes.
So we take 4,000 kids and put them into a school, or even 100 kids in a school, and somehow we don't consider the fact that we should have that same safety plan and that same, we're requiring it on one end and we ignore it when it was some of our greatest assets that we have, the most valuable thing to us, our kids.
Yes.
We're ignoring our duty and responsibility to make sure that we have a safe learning environment.
Yes.
Want to run with that a little bit?
Yes. So I find it, when I first started, my first assignment was, it's a school that no longer exists, but it was Southwestern High School. When you did a query of the different demographics of that school, and it was a cross section of everyone from every different background. One of the things that we found is that we were servicing students in one school from 18 different zip codes around the city, and so our kids have to traverse through different neighborhoods that may be, unfamiliar to them or maybe less friendly in some cases. And so whether they are walkers, whether they catch public transportation, school, these young people have to, come to school in the morning and get home in the evening safely. But to travel, maybe 5 or 6 zip codes away just to get home, that's a long time.
Right.
And so with that understanding that dynamic, we always stood in the gap between realizing that, there are certain neighborhoods that gather in certain places. The main meeting place for every day is the cafeteria. And so you were able to develop those relationships as a school-based officer with those young people. And they will be able to give you information that may be useful to you later at a later date.
So I'll make an argument. You're right. There's a strong movement out there saying we shouldn't have law enforcement officers in schools, and I try to wrap having served in that position for a while and actually supervised a group of officers in schools for a couple of decades. I try to wrap my head around that whole thought process, and I keep coming back to one thing. There's such an bias against law enforcement officers across this country. It's really grown in the last couple of years with a number of events. Regardless, I guess my question is it's easy to demonize someone when you don't know them.
Correct.
And that's what we find, across the country. You've got a bunch of people, because of their own self-serving interests, have really put it at the feet of law enforcement. Everything is wrong with society, and it's very much unfair, because there are some 800,000 men and women who suit up and show up every day and make a difference, and yet we'll point to a small handful of incidents and say the entire system's broken. And because of that, we're all painted with that broad brush.
Yes.
In reality, that's not the case.
Yeah,
serving in the schools, working, building those relationships with kids, allow us to not only provide a safer learning environment, but also build those relationships to recognize that those people who would argue that law enforcement officers shouldn't be in school, maybe they're afraid that they might realize that we're not the bad guys that we've been portrayed to be. It's all about the image. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so it's funny that those relationships that you build with young people, they last a lifetime.
Absolutely.
And I'll take, for example, during my career, when I was assigned to the high school that I graduated from, and I lived in that neighborhood until I was 21 years old. So I moved away, became a police officer, and then later gets assigned back to that community. And I'll tell you, you are more of a community service officer than an enforcer. I tell the story, and I'll use a different name so I don't impact anybody. But there was a lady by the name of Mrs. Jones. So when I was a kid, my childhood nickname in the neighborhood was Chip. From watching.
I'm going to start calling you Chip.
Yeah,
from here on out. Okay. All right.
and that's because I watched Eric Estrada and on the show as a kid. So there was a time where a young lady called my mother and says, "Kim, can you have Chip call me because I have kids hooking school behind my house?" And so that's a community service officer. She didn't think of me as Officer Boatwright. She thought of me as Chip, because I was a member of that community. And so those relationships, again, are long-lasting. People that make the argument that young people shouldn't have police protection, I always ask them, what college did you go to? And, I went to University of Michigan. Well, University of Michigan has a police department, a university police department. So why should they have less protection than what you had when you were going through school? When you were matriculating, you had those same protections. So our young people deserve that. They deserve a fighting chance.
Exactly. I used to, show up at events and people come up to me and tell me they were a resource officer and walk away, and people with me say, well, who was that? My answer was always the same. It's, well, it was either so-and-so, or it must have been a good kid, because I don't remember, because you have a tendency of dealing with the kids that have the most need.
Yes.
So I've developed relationships over that time that still serve me today, and we're talking about quite some time ago when I served in that position. So it's having a meaningful impact on kids at an age when they really need it.
Yes.
And look, one thing that really, and I think a lot of people can appreciate this, and a lot of them really don't give a lot of time to think about it. You take a kid who's living in an environment where it's just not a good environment. A broken family, struggling, not getting regular meals. School, the safety that's provided at school, that safe environment is really the only safe haven they have in their lives.
Oh yeah.
So that's again, it goes back to the argument of why should we be at schools? Because schools are for learning.
Yes.
And if we don't take all of these external things that you see in our communities every single day and stop them at the door or at the gate of the school, they're going to be in our schools.
Yes.
And where's that safe haven?
And it's funny, again, the relationships you build. I mean, I can't tell you how many hairdos and haircuts and proms and shoes and fingernails and things like that we had to, put together to buy young people who just didn't have it. And that's because they develop these relationships with staff and they come to us with their problems. I can't tell you how many times I've come back from lunch and a note was under my door that, hey, Officer Boatwright, there's going to be a fight at this location. So it's those type of interactions where young people want to have that friendship. They want to have that building block and that relationship. But it's the external forces that decide that this is not a good idea. And why? Yeah. And it's all for clickbait. We just got to get away from that and let our young people thrive in a learning and in a safe environment that's conducive for learning.
So one of the other things that I've always found interesting, when I was a resource officer, we had and I'd like to talk about programs that you have within Baltimore and how, we talk about the evolution. So mine goes back a little ways. It still exists today. It's a very beneficial program, and it was brought in to our school system at a time when we were seeing people get hurt. Really, the violence in schools was escalating, and we saw a pattern and recognized we need to do something for it. And so the discussion is this: is a little bit of violence acceptable?
No.
And if you're in an environment of a school and you take the position a little violence is okay, well, where do you draw the line? Yes. When things are black and white, when if you cross this line, there's consequences with it, then it's very clear what you have. But when you blur those lines, well, people inevitably are always going to find where the blur ends.
Yes.
So I know when during my time there, we focused on the fact that there was a zero tolerance towards violence within the schools, but it wasn't designed to throw kids within a criminal justice system. It was really designed to create diversions for them to take conflict resolution. They're required to take conflict resolution in other classes, and for us, it turned out to be a very good program. What type of programs do you have in Baltimore, a school district that is really helping curb crime when we look at cities where there is no consequences for crime?
So it's funny. We've taken a different approach. We've used our traditional approach to handling things, and I'll break it down as such. Some organizations want you to have community conferencing. They want you to have a diversion program and things like that in lieu of arrest. And so we didn't always have to focus on making an arrest. And it's not about the quantity of arrests. It's always about the quality of arrests. And so when you have an intervention, one of the ways that we would intervene, and this is a question, so I'll give you the question I would always ask. If you have an officer that has 25 arrests in 1 month, and you have an officer with 0 arrests in 1 month, who's more effective? And so that would be the question that I would ask the decision makers, and they couldn't tell me who. I was like, because this guy's school is quiet, or because this guy's taking a proactive approach. Right. And how do you quantify that? If I was able to mediate a situation, and that's what we did, because we're all from the same community, we would sit the young people down, and once we get to the bottom of why they were arguing or why there was a disagreement, more often than not, we found that these young people had way more in common than they thought, and they actually walk out becoming friends. And why? It's because we actually took the time and sat them in a room during the school day with an administrator, and we talked it out. And that's just the way that school police officers do their job.
Yeah, I think and age comes with experience, and experience comes with knowledge and a little bit more better understanding. And kids, some are more advanced than others, but in reality, I don't think they, for us, during my time there, I've always, kind of preached the fact that, hey, what we have here is an incident or some trigger that has happened, and then we have some action that are taken because of it. Mm-hmm. And most don't think that there's a whole process in between.
Yes.
Where you analyze, cause and effect of each one of these. They just go from here to here, and that's how violence happens within schools. And so that's why I found a lot of our programs were very beneficial. You're right. Look, as a law enforcement officer, I never really saw my job as going out there and arresting people. I saw it more of trying to correct behavior, and arrest is just one avenue in correcting that behavior. What we're trying to do is we're trying to set those perimeters and create safer environments.
Yes, and you're allowing the person, your arrestee or the suspect, to get the resources that they need. It may not always be a penalty, for jail or prison. It could be that they need other resources, and the only way they get those resources if someone hears their problem.
So one other thing that there's a resource officer model, a school resource officer model that and training specifically for that. It talks about the roles of law enforcement, and there's really three strong sides to being a resource officer. One of them is that is within those schools and providing the safety and security within the schools. But there are two other aspects too. One of them is law-related education. If there's a better understanding of what police officers do and the roles that they play and why the rule of law exists, then there's a greater respect when you truly understand it.
Yes.
And the other one is that law enforcement officers, like it or not, although they may not have a degree to hang on a wall to show that they're counselors, they certainly are reality-based counselors based off of their experience of working, and they bring another dynamic to within the schools. Can you talk about some of the experiences that you've had of how those three elements play a key role in maybe lowering the temperature within a community, within a school system or a school that's surrounded by kind of chaos outside the gates?
Yeah, it's funny. In our city, most of our schools are what we would call walk-up schools. That they're located within neighborhoods and communities, and so it's very important in order to tone some of the noise down, is to clearly understand and clearly define your role. And so when we get to the point of not engaging in non-police activities, and what do I mean by non-police activity? If little Johnny's walking down the hallway and little Johnny doesn't want to take his hat off, our administrative staff should be able to deal with that, and the teachers should be able to deal with that without getting the police involved.
Exactly.
And so calling the police because of disruptive behavior is not a police function. And so I would condition the staff and everyone that worked in the building that I work with, only call me if you would dial 911.
Yeah.
If you wouldn't dial 911, don't get on the radio and call for me. And so once they started to understand my role in the building as a school-based officer when I was there, then my calls for service became less and less, and my interactions switched. The paradigm shifted from only negative interactions, where I had more time to positively impact our young people, and that's with extracurricular activities. I was able to coach multiple sports and do some other activities, and kids got to see me outside of the uniform. And that's one of the roles that most of our police officers, they serve as mentors, they serve as coaches.
Exactly.
They serve on these various boards. I was an advisor for a class, so we had to sponsor their prom and their class trips and things like that. So they saw me more as a part of the school community than an occupying force. And so some of these advocacy groups that are totally against police being in school, they don't understand the interesting dynamic that police officers have with young people, because you know what? We get information and we give information with helping our young people understand the law. And give them classes on what to do when you're stopped by police. And what we're thinking as a police officer, if I'm stopping you in a car, I'm going to explain to you what I'm thinking when I see you move, when I see you do this, and things like that. So our young people are armed with the best information that when they have a police encounter, it does not have to always end or become negative.
There's a movement across this country that you'll see a lot of prosecutors that are trying to do social reform through, not through the legislature, but through their own decision on what crimes they're going to
prosecute.
Yeah. And it's creating a lot of problems. It's creating problems that are far beyond, have little to do with law enforcement, have everything to do with law enforcement. You have creating food, creating an atmosphere where businesses are leaving communities. What is the quality of life of a community? What's the ability to have access to, to services and to stores and, drugstores and all of these things? But in reality, they're not happening.
That's correct.
What we're seeing across this country are businesses that are taking two approaches. One approach is it's just not profitable anymore because there's no deterrence of the theft that is existing within my store. And then there are now businesses that are stepping up saying, you know what, I can't with a good conscience have employees in this environment. Yeah. It's not safe for them. And what does that say about a community when that's where we are, when we have policies, failed policies, that are creating such, that really deteriorating communities, the very communities that claim that these adjustments that in the criminal justice system is going to help, is actually harming them even more. But I want to take it a little bit further, because this is the role of a resource officer. Our job is not to go in and arrest kids as a resource
that's
officer.
correct.
Our job is to create a safe working environment and work within that environment to maintain a safe environment. And arrest is not always the answer.
That's correct.
However, sometimes arrest is the answer, because some people just need to be taken out. That's most of the crime, committed in any community is committed by a small percentage of people, and they do it because they don't recognize the consequences associated with it in some cases. So I'm going to pose a question for you. And you deal with it every day of dealing with kids and know with that, how do you draw those parameters? Tell me what good we're doing to a kid who crosses the line, who acts out, who does a little violence, a little bit, and we don't hold them accountable. And then it escalates, until a point now the kid's sitting in prison because of some incident that my question is this: where do we go wrong in trying to correct that behavior early on and save that kid before he ever gets to the point where he's too far gone?
Yeah, so what we're doing is we're actually setting these young people up for failure. We're not exposing them to what the real world has for them, immediate consequences for your actions. And you just said it. Our role is not to make an arrest, but sometimes an arrest is warranted. But the arrest is to get you resources and services so you understand not to make that same type of mistake or behavior. That behavior, that behavior is not acceptable. So what we must do is arm our young people with the best information available. And how do we do that? We show them that you should not be limited. You shouldn't limit yourself to only understanding the narrow mind of political figures who have a different agenda. You have to understand that if you cross certain lines in certain areas, that you will be held accountable immediately. I mean, I'll take Baltimore for an example. For the last 8 years, we had a prosecutor who decided that certain crimes that were nonviolent were not going to be tolerated. And so she did that, but didn't educate the public that it's still illegal. And so the mindset is that I can do what I want. I can smoke marijuana. I can steal. I can do anything as long as I don't hurt someone. And so having that approach, gave people a false sense of understanding of the law, because when you try to correct that behavior, they believe, because of these prosecutors that make these social justice movements, that they believe that they are right because the prosecutor won't prosecute the crime. However, if you go 1 mile up in some locations to another jurisdiction, you cross that city line or that boundary, that other prosecutor is definitely enforcing the law. And so they find themselves in a trick bag where they walk on the other side of the boundary into another jurisdiction, and now they're being held accountable, and they don't have an understanding why. Like you said, they found themselves with escalating behaviors. They're sitting in a jail cell. And it's only because they were not properly informed by those that took up the flag of this social justice movement, and they did it in the wrong way. You cannot do it as a prosecutor. That's not the role of a prosecutor, to change law, to decide what laws are not going to be prosecuted. That job is for a lawmaker. If you want to become a delegate or a senator, that's your role if you want to change the law. But to become a prosecutor and decide that you're not going to prosecute crimes, one important part of that is you're not giving the victim the proper services. And who are these victims? These are our businesses. These are our community members, and they want corrective action taken. When you're a victim of a crime, you want the person to be held accountable.
Yeah, and look, I'm gonna add to that it's almost criminal to not hold people accountable.
Yes, because
we are, as you said, setting them up for failure. So when we look further down the line and see that they're repeat offenders over and over, and we see them escalate over time, I had a guest here on a podcast a while back, and he said something pretty profound. What he talked about a particular case that he worked, Marvin Richardson with ATF. He talked about a case where he worked where an individual who, and I'll just summarize it, who had contact with law enforcement, but nothing was done to him. And then it escalated and escalated. It continued and continued and continued until it resulted in the homicide of several people. And his I guess his thought was, you know what? If they had intervened with this kid early on, would these people have died?
Yes.
And so, it's almost criminal to somehow think that we're not going to hold people accountable, and somehow that's beneficial to them, because really it could be disastrous for them themselves.
Well, what we saw in Baltimore, and thankfully that prosecutor is no longer in office. The residents, decided that they wanted to go in a different direction. I mean, 70% of the voters, voted for other candidates, but that prosecutor would, in favor of a high conviction rate, would exchange guilty convictions for serious crimes for little time or no time at all. And so that really, really set a bad precedent, because people saw some of these people they saw these suspects committing these crimes. They saw them get arrested for the crimes. They saw them on TV with their face, and then they see them back on the street with little to no accountability, because that prosecutor cut a deal in favor of touting a high conviction rate. Yeah. Because of a plea deal.
I want to shift gears a little bit, and there's a challenge that we have in law enforcement across the board. And that is that we see law enforcement officers, because of the environment. Law enforcement officers, and not anyone. I don't care what your profession is. I don't care who you are. When it comes down to what your job is, you could be a printer, you can be a painter, you can be whatever. There's two things that every person, I think, wants, and they want to know is what they're doing is important, and they're appreciated for what they do. So the problem we have in law enforcement, and just like the attack of whether we should have law enforcement officers in schools, it has created an environment where people are leaving our profession at a rate we've never, ever seen before, because they just don't feel appreciated, and they don't feel what they're doing is important, because of these policies that exist in many cases by rogue prosecutors who somehow want to adjust the social injustice, not looking at the damage they've done within their own community. At the same time, we don't have people coming in and taking his job because they've demonized us so bad.
Yeah.
So what's the impact you're having on your agency? What's the impact you're having in Maryland as a state president? Because I see that as an existential threat to this profession that is probably going to last a decade, if not even a generation.
Yes. Yeah. So you're absolutely correct. And the fact that we are seeing high turnover rates. What we have to focus on with recruitment is also the retention piece. Yeah. A lot of times we throw a lot of incentives for people to come to take the job.
I agree.
But those that are already here, we limit the resources and the benefits that we give them.
It shouldn't be recruiting and retention. It should be retention and then recruiting.
And recruiting, right. Yes. And so one of the things that we're doing, like in Maryland, we had a bill drafted last year in the Senate. It was Senate Bill 949, and we reintroduced in our legislature that just started, is an educational incentive. And it's the police officer's equivalent of the GI Bill. So if you want to go back to school, we incentivize you going back to school. You can get an educational credit for going to school, pay for going, or you can go attend one of the state-run institutions for free. And if you do not want to use that benefit, you could pass it to a dependent child. So that is an incentive that we're trying to do that for people that are already in the profession. And so we all, feel that education is the key. A better educated cop makes better decisions. And so we're trying to make sure that we do everything we can to give them the tools and resources. So when we're identifying what's in the recruitment piece, we just need to make sure that we're focusing both on recruitment and retention. Because what happens is we see too many times people come and do this job for a few years, and then they say, you know what? I can go and make money being a YouTuber, or doing something else, TikTok, and so we got to keep good people who actually care about our communities. We got to keep them in this profession, and the only way to do that is find creative ways and creative incentives to attract them to stay.
Absolutely. Well, Clyde, I appreciate all you do as a state president. Some challenging times in your state, representing your members. I appreciate what you do in your own union, but I also appreciate the person you are and the job that you and your fellow officers do in protecting the schools in Baltimore.
Thank you.
If final words you'd like to share?
Yeah, I'll say this. Police officers that work in a school environment are a unique breed, and
not for everyone.
It's not for everyone. It's an acquired taste. It's almost like drinking a Guinness. It's an acquired taste.
It's a good comparison.
So I'll just say hats off to all of the folks that serve as resource officers, and because we see you, we want you to know that you are not forgotten, and that is a unique job, and just continue to keep up the fight, because ultimately a resource officer is the bridge between our young people and the law enforcement community. And be careful what you do as a resource officer, because somebody could be watching. I'm excited to see one of my students that was a athlete for me, never came to me and talked about being a police officer, but he recently shared that it was because of him watching me from afar he decided to join this profession. So I have a long list. I have a coaching tree now. I see one lieutenant, awesome, a couple sergeants, and guys that have been promoted in various police departments that came through that coaching tree. And to a man, each one of them have decided that it was that influence and that positive interaction that they maybe not share with everyone, that influenced and impacted their decision to join this profession.
I'll give you an example of that. I know you and I told you a story before, but it kind of shocked me. We had an event here in Washington, and it was someone at Quantico Base who needed a letter. He actually needed some permission to attend an event we had. Mm-hmm. And so, you know what? I'm not in a position to be able to send a letter and tell this person it's okay to go to this event that was hosted by a public official. But what I can do is, if you give me the supervisor's name, I'll send him an email and explain what it was, because it was an officer who was going and he wanted to bring his son who was stationed in Quantico. Uh-huh. And I didn't pay attention. I got the email and I responded back to it, and the kid sergeant over at Quantico said, "Hey, absolutely, sounds like a great event. I'll give him clearance to go to it." You may not recognize me, but I was one of your explorers in your agency, and I look at the things that was done and experiences I got from the people that worked with them during that time. Mm-hmm. It put me where I am today.
Nice.
So you just never know. You never know the impact you have on people.
That's correct.
And just keep up the great work, and we appreciate all you do.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
And to our viewers and our listeners, thank you for joining the Blue View podcast, where we talk about the issues that are so vitally important to the men and women of law enforcement who suit up and show up every day in communities across this country and make a difference. Thank you.
Be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you get your podcasts. To get the latest from the National FOP, make sure to follow us on Twitter and Facebook at GLFOP and on Instagram at FOP National. Thanks again. We'll see you next time.